So I need to tell you about Maya. We worked together at a retail store about 3 years back when I was 23. I'm 26 now, but I still think about it more than I'd like to admit. I'll call her Maya to keep things anonymous. The thing is, before we ever went on a date, the warning signs were everywhere. She'd show up on days she wasn't scheduled just to browse the aisles near my register, and I'd feel her eyes on me constantly throughout my shift. Looking back, I should have trusted my gut. A few months after we started dating, everything became suffocating. I couldn't go to the gym, couldn't meet up with my brother, couldn't even sit alone with my thoughts. She demanded to know my location every hour, who I was texting, and why I was texting them. If I missed one of her calls, I'd come back to 30 messages and an interrogation that would spiral into a screaming match, even if I'd just been in the shower. I couldn't even watch a movie without her accusing me of ignoring her. Eventually, I ended it, but she refused to accept it. She'd wait in the parking lot after my shifts, and when I'd walk to my truck, she'd block my path and beg me to reconsider. I was exhausted. One evening, she showed up unannounced and demanded we talk. I agreed, mostly because she kept threatening to take me to small claims court over something ridiculous I won't detail here, and she'd dangle it over my head to force contact. So I got into her car. She repeated the same guilt trips I'd heard 100 times before. I told her I was leaving, but then her phone rang. It was her brother. She looked at me and said, "If you try to leave, I'll tell him to file the paperwork tonight." I'd had enough. I said, "I'm done with this," and reached for the door handle. It was locked. As I flipped the lock, she grabbed my wrist and sank her nails deep into my forearm. I turned and saw something in her face I'd never seen before. It wasn't sadness or frustration. It was rage, cold and unfiltered. I'm a tall guy, and she was barely over 5 feet, so I knew I could break free if necessary. I shoved the door open and tried to pull away, but her grip was iron. I told her to let go. She didn't. I kept pulling, and I could feel my skin tearing under her nails. So I made a split-second decision and yanked her forward onto the passenger seat, giving me just enough time to rip free and sprint to my truck. I drove home like I was being chased, and God, I wish that was the end of it. But it wasn't. Maya lives 4 blocks from me. We're practically neighbors. That night, while I was playing on my Xbox, I heard an engine idling outside, but I chalked it up to the game I was playing, some open-world racing thing. I'd also had a couple of edibles earlier, so I figured I was just being paranoid. A few minutes passed, and then I heard a soft tap on my bedroom window. I froze. I thought maybe I'd imagined it, since edibles sometimes make me anxious, especially after what had just happened. But then I heard it again, followed by a woman's voice saying my name. It was Maya. My heart started pounding. My blinds are pretty thin, so I knew she could see me sitting there. I didn't want to open the window because I now understood she was capable of real violence. I pretended I hadn't heard her, hoping she'd just give up and leave. She didn't. A minute later, she started pounding on the glass. Her voice shifted from soft and apologetic to sharp and venomous. I couldn't make out every word, but it was something like, "You don't get to ignore me. You're a coward." I knew I had to do something. I should have called the cops right then, but I didn't want to overreact. So I made the idiotic decision to open my front door and confront her. I asked her what she wanted and why she couldn't just leave me alone. Her voice softened again, and she said she just wanted her hoodie back. I snapped at her and said she couldn't show up at my house at 2 o'clock in the morning over a piece of clothing. I told her if she didn't leave immediately, I was calling the police. That's when she lost it. She started sobbing hysterically, screaming at me through the tears. For a second, I actually felt guilty, but then my blood went cold. I saw something move. To her left, near the big oak tree in my front yard, a figure in a dark hoodie was half hidden behind the trunk, watching us. She noticed me staring and realized I'd seen them. She lunged forward and grabbed my arm. At the same time, the person bolted from behind the tree and sprinted toward my door. I didn't think. I slammed the door on Maya's arm. She screamed and yanked it back. I locked the deadbolt just as the other person reached my porch. My chest felt tight, like I couldn't get enough air. I held up my phone and showed them the screen with 911 dialed. They both ran back to her car, jumped in, and sped off. I stood there shaking, trying to process what had just happened. An officer came by about 20 minutes later, took my statement, and said they'd follow up if anything came of it. Of course, nothing did. There was no proof, no witnesses, no evidence. As far as I know, she was never charged with anything. What they wanted to do to me that night, I don't know for sure. But she's had people jumped before, beaten up over petty drama. So I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say I'm lucky that person behind the tree moved when they did. What would you do if you woke up and felt hands on your skin, only to discover your ex-boyfriend sitting in your locked bedroom at 2 o'clock in the morning? What if he told you he wasn't there to hurt you, just to talk? What if you realized he'd made a copy of your key months ago and never told you? My name is Jess, and I haven't had a full night's sleep since last Thursday. Not because I'm an insomniac, but because closing my eyes feels dangerous now. That's what happens when someone you trusted shows you a side of themselves you only see in thrillers. I ended things with my boyfriend Caleb about a month ago. It wasn't explosive, at least not initially. We'd been together for 10 months. In the beginning, he was attentive, always messaging me and calling me throughout the day like any good partner would. At first, it felt like devotion, the kind you think you're fortunate to find. But gradually, it morphed into control. He'd get irritated if I didn't respond within minutes. He'd ask invasive questions like who smiled at me at the coffee shop or whether I noticed anyone staring. Sometimes he'd appear at my workplace without warning, just standing across the street like he was monitoring me. He even showed up at clubs when I was out with my girlfriends and would insist I leave with him. My friends grew to despise him for exactly those reasons. He never believed me, no matter what I said. I didn't break things off until he suggested we install tracking software on each other's phones for safety. Not location sharing, actual spyware. That was my breaking point. I told him we were done, and at first, he wept. Then he went completely silent. I remember ending that final call with a strange knot in my stomach, like I was bracing for something terrible. For a little while, everything seemed fine. I blocked his number and tried to rebuild my life. I rejoined my gym, started meal prepping again, just trying to reclaim normalcy. But roughly a week after the breakup, I started receiving odd messages, not from Caleb directly, or at least not from a number I recognized, but from unknown numbers with no context. They were brief, usually just a single cryptic sentence. I never responded. That's how you confirm to spammers that your number is active. I just blocked each one and moved on. I didn't mention it to anyone. I convinced myself it was spam because I've always gotten junk texts. But then things escalated beyond messages. One night, I was lying in bed and got up to use the bathroom. As I stepped into the hallway, I thought I heard a faint sound from downstairs near the entryway. I'm not the type to investigate strange noises. I get scared easily in the dark, which is part of why I always preferred having a partner so I wouldn't have to be alone constantly. I didn't go check. I told myself it was the heating system or something. I've been in this apartment for nearly 2 years, most of that time with my ex Mark, then Caleb for the remainder, but rarely by myself. I know it sounds, and that wasn't one of them. So after I used the bathroom, I went straight back to my room and dove under the covers, as if a thin blanket could protect me. Another night, around 2 a.m., I could have sworn I heard a door inside my apartment creak open from somewhere outside my bedroom. That's what woke me up, so I wasn't entirely certain. It might have been part of a dream. Still, my pulse was racing. I texted my family group chat saying, "I keep hearing things at night. I'm getting scared." They were all asleep, though, so I eventually drifted off again. That weekend, I returned home from visiting my mom and instantly sensed something was wrong. Nothing was stolen or damaged, but I had this feeling that doors were positioned differently than I'd left them. I know that sounds paranoid, but it's not. I have a habit of closing doors fully or nearly fully when I leave. Every door in the apartment was now wide open. There was no breeze at all. I keep the air conditioning running most of the time. I walked through slowly, inspecting each room. My stomach sank when I noticed the hallway closet was slightly ajar. I knew something was off then. I always leave that closet shut. There's no reason not to, and the door tends to swing open on its own if left unlatched. I stared at it for what felt like an eternity before I finally approached. When I pulled it fully open, there was nothing. Just jackets and sneakers, exactly as I'd left them. That night, I wedged a chair under my bedroom doorknob and slept with a kitchen knife under my pillow. I kept the lamp on. I must have dozed off eventually because I woke to the sound of movement, just a soft shuffling. I sat up slowly, disoriented, and then realized the lamp was now off and the room was pitch black. I glanced toward the door. It was open, but I had wedged a chair under the handle. How was it wide open? At first, I thought maybe I'd dreamed barricading the door and leaving the light on, or maybe I'd gotten up in my sleep, but I quickly discovered how mistaken I was. I saw something at the foot of my bed in the darkness. At first, I couldn't identify what it was. It was just a dark shape in the shadows. But when I finally realized I was looking at the top of someone's head, it was too late because I felt two hands begin stroking my feet, and I completely lost it. I screamed until my lungs were empty, and that's when I recognized Caleb's voice telling me to calm down. But I kept screaming, so he climbed on top of me and clamped his hand over my mouth. He said he wasn't there to harm me, just to talk. He told me he wouldn't remove his hand until I agreed to be quiet. So I nodded. The first question I asked him was how he'd gotten into my apartment. He said he'd made a copy of my key months ago when we were dating, in case of emergencies. He never mentioned doing this. Complete psychopath behavior. He must have snuck out one night with my keys to get them duplicated somewhere. As I sat there listening to him ramble, I considered grabbing the knife, but I was too terrified. I knew if I went for it, I'd have to actually use it. He kept insisting he wasn't there to hurt me, just to talk. But it was obvious he was simply there to intimidate me into getting back together with him. I was too frightened to refuse, worried about what he might do. So I said yes, but I asked him to please leave for the night because I was shaken. I think he sat on my bed for half an hour before he finally left. The moment he was gone, I called the police and explained the break-in. I said I was afraid he might still be nearby, so they'd actually respond. When they arrived, I filed an official report, which I later used to obtain a restraining order against Caleb with enough witness statements backing me up since I couldn't physically prove he'd broken in. A detective eventually traced the anonymous numbers back to his cell phone through some burner app, which also helped secure the restraining order. I stayed with my parents until I could find a new apartment. My advice to all women is this: at the first sign of controlling or unstable behavior in the man you're with, seriously consider getting out as soon as possible just to protect yourself. I still have nightmares about waking up to him in my room, and I actually had to think about using a knife on another human being. I dated him during my last year of college, and I'm 24 now, so it wasn't that long ago, but it still feels close enough that I can remember exactly how my stomach used to tighten whenever my phone buzzed. For privacy reasons, for this story, his name is Daniel. We met through mutual friends at a house party, and he was funny in this quiet way that made him seem safe, like someone who paid attention instead of needing attention. Looking back, there were things I should have noticed early on, but at the time they felt harmless. He remembered everything I said, even small details I'd forgotten mentioning. He liked routines. He liked knowing my schedule. At first, it felt flattering. Over time, it felt like I was being managed. He'd ask where I was going, how long I'd be gone, who I'd be with, and if my answers changed even slightly, he'd press. Not aggressively, just persistently, like he was collecting data. If I didn't respond right away, he'd send follow-up messages, not angry, just checking, then checking again. It didn't turn into fights at first. It turned into explanations. I was always explaining myself. About 6 months in, I started feeling exhausted. I stopped going out as much. I stopped doing things spontaneously because it was easier than dealing with the questions afterward. He'd show up at my apartment sometimes without telling me, usually with food, acting like he was doing me a favor. If I seemed surprised, he'd say he was just nearby and thought of me. When I finally tried to talk to him about needing space, he listened quietly, nodded, and told me he understood, but nothing changed. The breakup happened after I realized I was editing my life in advance just to avoid his reactions. When I told him it was over, he didn't cry or yell. He just stared at me for a long time and said, "I don't think you've really thought this through." I blocked him later that night. For about a week, things were quiet. Then I started noticing small things. My apartment door would be unlocked when I was sure I'd locked it. My shower curtain would be pulled slightly to one side when I always left it centered. I told myself I was being paranoid. I live alone, and paranoia comes easy when you're suddenly by yourself after a relationship. Then one night, around midnight, I got a text from an unknown number that just said, "You forgot to water the plant in the kitchen." I froze because I had a single plant in my kitchen and it had been wilting. I didn't reply. More messages came over the next few days, always from different numbers, always small observations. What I cooked, what show I fell asleep to, the fact that I'd moved my couch a few inches closer to the window. I changed my locks. I didn't tell anyone because I didn't want to sound dramatic. A few nights later, I was lying in bed when I heard what sounded like a soft click, like plastic tapping against plastic. It came from my living room. I didn't move. I just listened. After a while, it stopped. The next morning, I found my spare phone missing from my junk drawer, the one I kept charged but never used. I assumed I'd misplaced it until I got a voicemail notification later that night. It was from that phone. The voicemail was short, just breathing. Then Daniel's voice quietly saying my name like he was standing close to the microphone. I called the police. They came, took notes, asked if I'd given him a key at any point. I had. Months ago. They told me without proof of forced entry, there wasn't much they could do. The final thing happened 2 nights later. I woke up because I felt like someone was in the room. Not a sound, just that awareness. I turned on my bedside lamp and saw my bedroom door open. I always sleep with it closed. On the floor, just inside the doorway, was my spare phone, powered on, recording. On the screen, I could see the red timer still counting. I didn't listen to the audio. I didn't need to. I grabbed my keys, left everything else, and drove to my sister's place in the middle of the night. I moved out a week later. New apartment, new locks, new number. I never saw Daniel again. He never contacted me after that. Sometimes that's the part that scares me the most. Not that he escalated, but that once he knew I understood what he was capable of, he simply stopped. Like he'd already proven whatever it was he needed to prove.